I am Diane Fenner. Welcome. The program today, What's Your Legacy, features Claire Willis, a clinical social worker and a lay chaplain for a Buddhist approach to What's Your Legacy. She has a new book out, Opening to Grief, and today she is going to be calling on her experience working with people facing end-of-life issues, and we're going to be talking about legacy letters. That's a little different from your last will and testament, but it is very much derived from the same place. It's also called ethical wills. Many of us have prepared legal wills, and we're familiar with distributing our belongings, but few of us have considered leaving ethical wills, also known as legacy letters. And that's a record of who we are and our values and the stories that we want to tell and pass on to all of the people who are in our lives. And I think that this information is even more important now during the pandemic, when we are all thinking about what our values are and what's important to us when we don't run around and buy things, and when we're just with ourselves and with each other. I wrote a legacy letter I stumbled onto a seminar that Claire was giving, and I listened to everything that she said, and it hit so strongly. It just landed with me, and I ended up writing a legacy letter, and I can't tell you how happy my two offspring were. So I got very excited about this, and I think you're going to love it too. Why don't I let Claire speak?
So, hello everybody, and thank you for coming, and thank you for your interest in the work. So this, what I'm going to be talking about is based on a book I wrote called Lasting Words, A Guide to Finding Meaning Toward the Close of Life. And it could easily have been called Lasting Words, A Guide to Finding Meaning as We Grow Older, because as it turns out, all the work in the book is really are issues that as we age, we are coming to terms with. So I just want to say for a minute, a little bit about what drove this book. This book was my thesis during a chaplaincy program. And the reason I wrote it is I have a lot of passion about this work because I didn't know my parents' stories or childhood or anything about them. My mother came from a really troubled background, and she couldn't talk about her life, and she couldn't tolerate hearing my father. And so after they died, I realized there was a whole empty spot in my history that I knew nothing about, and I really had no way to recreate. And so I decided to make this work part of my life's work. And I think for those of you that have children who may feel that your kids aren't particularly interested right now, I think that for most of us, there's an access point to wanting to know more about our parents after they die than there may be when we're trying to separate from them, or we're distracted raising our families, or whatever it is we're doing. So I just wanted to say that. Also, I want to say that I lead bereavement groups. I have a lot of focus on grief in my work. And I was at a funeral recently for one of my clients. And when her sister and mother saw me, they started to sob, and they said they were so grateful to have something in writing from their deceased daughter and sister. And I think in this time of texts and emails and tweets, it's really easy not to put things in our handwriting. And so as I talk for the next few minutes about my work, think about doing it in writing, because there's something much more intimate about holding something that someone you loved wrote than just reading words that are typed. So I just wanted to start by saying that. So legacy as ecology. I like to analogize these two. Ecologists are often asked the question, where it is best to plant a young tree? Young trees grow better if they're planted in an area near older trees, where the roots follow the pathways of the older trees, and they're better able to implant themselves. Over time, the roots graft to one another, creating an interdependent foundation underground where the stronger trees share resources with the younger ones, and the whole forest is healthier for it. So this is an ecological description of what a legacy, leaving a legacy is about. So fundamentally, it's an interconnection across time. And I think we have a responsibility to those that follow us, come after us. We need to hear from those who have gone before us. We need their lessons and wisdom, and we need to share our resources. And I think especially during this time of this pandemic, when there are a lot of lessons to be learned. So as Diane said, in a regular will, as you all know, we distribute material possessions, and likely you all have them. But an ethical and a spiritual will, which I'm going to use interchangeably, those words, is a way to transmit meaning and lessons and stories to those that follow us. It's a way for us to sort of in a systematic way gather and preserve and communicate our values, our wisdom, and love for future generations. So its primary intention is to make a contribution. So that's how it differs from, for instance, a memoir. A Harvard physician named Andrew Weil describes it. He says, I think its main importance is what it can give us in the midst of life. So as we set out to just think about this for the next few minutes, I want you to think about a couple of questions. What do you most want to preserve from your life? So just to hold that for a minute. And then what actions might lead you to feel that your life was complete as it is? We all share common wishes. We all share the wish to feel we belong. We feel the wish to feel deeply known. This, as a little anecdote to this one, when this book came out that this work is based on in 1915, my 2015, whoopsie. And I talked about the wish to feel deeply known. There were 150 people at the book reading, and my daughter said to me after the reading, I didn't know you could talk in front of people. And I thought, you know, our children don't know us in full ways. A lot of them don't know what we do during the day. I work privately. I work behind a closed door. I do clinical work. It's not open. They had no way to know whether I could talk in front of people or not, but because they're busy getting enough sleep and dealing with their children. So it was just interesting. And this is one of the things that legacy work can do. It gives your children an access point to another way of knowing you. We all share the wish to be remembered. And I think for most of us, we share the wish to feel that our life has made a difference. And then to feel blessed and to bless our loved ones is, I think, another common wish. And when I say bless, I'm talking about touching the unborn goodness in others. And then to leave our life in an orderly way. So each chapter in this book is based on a common area that research indicates people are thinking about as they age and as they approach death. So I'm going to just talk for a little bit about each chapter in the book and give you some ideas for how to think about that. So the first chapter in the book is called My Journey, a Life Review. So what is a life review? It's really a common task that people often go to towards the last half of their life. And it can offer us a sense of identity at a time of gradual diminishment. It can help reduce feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. And it's a way to make sense of how we lived. And so in doing so, we can begin to leave a legacy through a life review as a gift to those we love. And it's actually the last chance we have to explain, integrate, and reconcile our life experiences. So some of the questions that I usually ask people to think about when they're doing a life review is, what have been the primary sources of meaning in your life? And do the people who love you know that? What have been some of the critical turning points in your life? And then what shaped those choices? If you all probably remember The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. When I mention that poem, invariably people go, oh yes, I remember that. Because we all have roads we haven't taken, where there may be a little bit of energy still lingering there that we wonder about. I wonder if I'd done this, this, or this, how my life might have turned out differently. What have been building blocks and stumbling blocks, the critical life events that you've had? One of the common exercises I give people is to make a list of all your names you were ever called. And then what are the stories behind those names? And what that does is it gives you access to memories that you may not pull up if I said, what do you remember about? But when you take the time and you have a focused question like that, it will bring up memories that you probably haven't thought about in a long time. And invariably, when I do that exercise in a group, the stories that come tumbling out are poignant. They're stories of immigrants changing their names to be accepted. It can be poignant, and it can be tragic, and it can be hysterically funny. So that's one of the reflections for a life review. Another one is to think about how you want to be remembered by your grandchildren, if you have grandchildren or your children. So one of the things that I do, I have three grandchildren, ages 10 and 7. And when they come over, I often make notes after they leave. So I'll just give you a couple of examples, because I want them to have these documents when they're older. So one day my granddaughter said to me, Amma, what does God look like? And is God a man or a woman? And I said, no one knows whether God is female or male, but some people think they know. And then I said, well, what do you think? And she said, and she was about 6 at the time, and she said, I think God is a spirit. And then she said, let's Google God to see what God looks like. So these little interactions are so precious. At another time, I asked her, I said, when adults pick up the children at your nursery school, how do you know whether it's the grandparents or the parents? And she said, oh, that's easy. The parents are newer looking. It's like, so their language, the language of little ones is so fresh. So I try to journal these questions after they leave, because at some point I want to hand them back to my grandchildren. So another reflection for a life review: what are some of the critical lessons you've learned? And which of those do you want to pass on to those you love? And if you don't have children, it can be nieces, nephews, it can be colleagues. But what are the critical lessons you've learned? And the chances are that the lessons you've learned have probably come through suffering. And so there's a story behind them. If you had to be hospitalized precipitously for some extended period of time, what objects in your home would provide continuity, coherence, and meaning? What would you take with you? What are the things that are most critical? And then another question for reflections for a life review was, recall an obstacle that you overcame and the skills you used to do so. So that's the first chapter on doing a life review. And those are some of the questions. I hope just as you hear this, that you can think about how you might answer those. And I'm just going to pause and look at the Q&A. Oh, okay. The book's title is Lasting Words, A Guide to Finding Meaning Toward the Close of Life. Can legacy statements be probated? They can be put into your will. So the second chapter, so the first chapter is about life review, reviewing your life. And one of the things that I would say is, when you think about your life, do it in segments of 7 years. Because if I say, tell me some memories from your earlier life, it's easy to go blank. But if you say from 1 to 7 and 7 to 14, or in decades, 1 to 10, 10 to 20, but chunk it down, because that's the only way you'll be able to have access to some of the memories that you want. Okay, so the second chapter is on gratitude. And it leads off with a quote, a surprising quote actually, from Albert Schweitzer. And it goes like this: At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us owes the deepest thanks to those who have rekindled the inner light. So, this issue of gratitude is one of my favorite things to talk about because each of us probably, if I said to you, make a list of people to whom you owe a thank you note, you could probably write for a long time. And expressions of gratitude are an important part of creating a legacy, being remembered as a grateful person. But on another level, I want to say it's the one positive link to happiness. The research has pretty much substantiated this. And since we've learned recently in the last 20 years that the brain is more has more neuroplasticity than we previously thought, we can retrain ourselves in ways that are important. So this issue of gratitude is important because the more you can experience a sense of gratitude, the greater your capacity to hold suffering and grief. And that makes it important as we grow older. So where you place your attention shapes the brain, and your mind takes the shape of what it rests on. So just think about that. Your mind takes the shape of what it rests on. So whatever we attend to is what grows in us. The unfortunate and both fortunate part of this is that our minds are hardwired to be habituated toward the negative. It's not inherently a bad thing because it allowed us in ancient times to survive. But unfortunately, many of our minds currently are habituated towards the negative when we don't need to be. So an example of that is that you go in for a review from your boss and they say that 9 things are good and 1 thing is a growing edge. So where does your attention go? Or if Diane sends out an evaluation on this talk and 50 people say it was great and 1 person says it was terrible, I mean, I'm sitting here talking about this, but my attention would go towards the terrible thing and what did I do that wasn't so good and how can I improve that, so we all have some version of this being oriented towards the negative. So one of the things Rick Hansen says is, he's a psychologist and a researcher in this area, is that our attention is like a combination spotlight and vacuum cleaner. It highlights what it lands on, and then it sucks it into our brain. So you just think about that, because it gives us a measure of control over what we attend to. So let's say on a typical morning, you wake up, you use the toilet, you have a cup of coffee, you get dressed, and you either go on public transportation or get in your car to go to work. And if the toilet flushes and the coffee maker works and the car or the subway or the bus, whatever, gets where you're going, you don't stop and say, wow, everything worked this morning. But if the toilet clogs up or the coffee maker gets jammed or the subway's delayed or you have a fender bender getting to work, you might get to work and say you've had a crappy morning because you notice it. Our attention is grabbed when our expectations are broken. So think about that. So a couple of weeks ago, I was down on the Cape and the lights went out, and they went out for a long time. And when those lights came on, I can't tell you how grateful I felt, not only because there was no heat, but I was worried about what was in the refrigerator since I had just shopped. So if to think about our attention is grabbed when our expectations are broken. Negative experiences adhere to our mind like Velcro. We don't forget them. We may forget the details, but we don't forget the impact of a negative experience. Positive experiences tend to flow through us like water over Teflon. We don't remember them in the same proportion that we remember negative experiences. So what can we do about this? So one of the things that research has shown is that when we linger for 20 to 30 seconds when something good is happening, we begin to literally rewire the brain from being habituated towards what's negative to a more balanced view. Now, a lot of my work is with people with cancer. So I would never say to someone, you can't pay attention to what's negative, because we need to pay attention to what's negative. It's important that if you're sick and you need things and you're complaining and you're in pain, it's important to express our suffering. But how can we notice equally what's right alongside what's wrong? There's always some way we can redirect our attention. So not at the exclusion of what's wrong, but alongside what's wrong. And I just want to emphasize that, because my work is about listening to people suffering, and I don't want to minimize that, but also to pay attention to what's right. So one of the questions just to ask yourself is, what is your capacity to take in the good? What happens when you get a compliment at work? Do you brush it off, or can you really take it in? So some of the common obstructions to gratitude are feeling that we are entitled and have earned what we have, instead of saying, wow, this is a gift. So some of us may think, well, we worked hard, we're entitled to make a lot of money. This is a common one, but there's a lot of people that work really hard who don't make a lot of money. So seeing life and what we have as a gift rather than what we're entitled to is one way to, seeing life as an entitlement and our gifts as being earned is an obstruction to gratitude. Another one is comparing ourselves with others. That's a no-win street. Another one is having expectations that everything's going to work out, because then our attention is grabbed when our expectations are broken. So considering when you wake up in the morning, it could have been otherwise. It could have been that you don't wake up. Having the coffee maker work, it could have been it didn't work. The subway could shut down, and then being self-preoccupied is a real obstruction to gratitude. So when we can begin to cultivate an attitude of gratitude, our perceptions towards our life change, and our experience of life is based more on what we attend to than the particular details of it. So just to ask yourself, what are your habits of attention? Duke Medical School has done a lot of research on gratitude and gratitude journals for their doctors. And one of the things they found is that there are fewer medical errors. There is more pro-social behavior among the physicians, and physicians are sleeping better. Gratitude practices at Duke Medical Center are a big part of the training there. So one of the ways things I suggest people do, and this is documented in the literature, is to keep a gratitude journal. So before you go to bed, write down 3 things that worked that day for which you feel grateful. And one of the tricky things is not to write down something positive in negative language. So let's say you have 5 kids. To write down, today the kids weren't noisy, is a negative expression of a positive experience, and it won't have the same impact. What you want to write down is, today the house was quiet and peaceful. You hear the difference. So make sure to write positive things in positive language. When you keep a gratitude journal for 21 days, you will find that your happiness level increases. That is what the research says. It also will help redirect your attention the next day, if you're committed to the practice, to look for things that are right. Another way to think about it is to think at the end of the day, what have I done for others? And what have others done for me? And then, as I said at the beginning, make a list of all the people to whom you owe a thank you note. Because expressing gratitude, feeling it and then expressing it, improves the happiness level of both yourself and the recipient. So that the practice really draws us out of ourselves into a larger world we depend on and really didn't earn. It's just been given to us. How else would we explain the goodness in our life if we didn't think of it in terms of gratitude? So remember, lingering with what's good for 20 to 30 seconds begins to rewire your brain. it begins to move the mind from being habituated toward the negative towards a more balanced view, holding the positive, and it increases your resilience and your strength in holding grief and suffering. And that's something we are all dealing with right now. We're all dealing with some point, in some ways, with grief and the losses generated by COVID and the losses opened up from our past by COVID. That's that's the chapter on gratitude. So another way of leaving a legacy is through the chapter, through the practice from one of the chapters called forgiveness. So to forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover the prisoner was you. So what does it mean to have forgiveness? It means to release anger and blame. And it also means to relinquish hope of changing the past. And that's a tall order for a lot of people. We abandon our right to resentment and judgment when we come into a forgiveness process. And we also decrease the likelihood of depression. If you're going to be in a situation where you want to forgive somebody, writing reduces reactivity and will increase the likelihood of a more gentle response. So when I'm working with people who are dying or very sick, I don't ask them ever to whom do they want to be forgiven, because it's way too vulnerable. It leaves them open to waiting to hear from somebody. But what we can do is we can see to whom do we need to forgive. And I often say to clients, to whom do you need to say, I'm sorry? And then I ask them, what are the harms you perceive you did? Because often some of you may notice that you get an apology from someone and you're not always sure what it is they've apologized for. So identifying what you feel are the harms you've done is really an important part. And then forgiving yourself. That's a really important part of it. And releasing attachment to getting anything back, knowing that what you're doing is all you can do, and we can't control what comes from the other side. And I always say to people, can you forgive yourself for who and what you cannot yet forgive? Which is really important, because all of us have people in our lives where we've maybe been hurt and we just can't find the forgiveness for whatever we've done. We can't forgive ourselves, and we maybe can't forgive them. And that can result in a real block of our energy and our life force. And so starting with, can I forgive myself for what I can't yet forgive, often creates a sense of gentleness. So some of the reflections just to think about in this forgiveness is, what was possible for you at the time? What was the context? Because what we can do now, we probably couldn't have done 3 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so to consider the context, and then what is the role of your childhood in all of this? And as I said, what is it you need to feel apologize for? And then how can you extend compassion to yourself? And making sure to do it through a letter, especially if it's hot. And then the hard part is releasing any attachment to outcome and not waiting to hear back, but to knowing that you've done what you can do to settle this. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the chapter on forgiveness. So the next chapter is on hope, and what is it we can hope for as we grow older, as we approach death? I'm going to tell you the story about a client I had. She was a young mother. She had 2 children. She had stage 4 GIST, which is a gastrointestinal stromoid tumor, which will take, it leads to death. There's no way to avoid that. And I had this client and I said to her, what do you hope for? And she said, I've always been afraid to hope because everything I've hoped for has never happened. So I said, well, if you were hoping, what would you hope for? And she said, I would hope to live forever, or at least till my children are grown. And that wasn't possible. So I said, what would be your next hope? And she said, my next hope would be to have them remember me. And that's what I call in the chapter on hope, a reasonable hope. That's something that she could do. And so what she did was she decided to buy a book for each of her children who were 4 and 6 for each of their birthdays until they were 21. She was an English teacher and she was very widely read. And she wanted to buy a book that she'd read and let them know why this book was important to them at that age. And that was what she left behind for her children to achieve what was a reasonable hope. So I want to talk a little bit about hope and what makes reasonable hope. Reasonable hope is a term that was created by a colleague of mine named Kata Weingarten. And as it turns out, Joan Halifax, a teacher and author, and Joanna Macy, an environmentalist, also have similar descriptions of this hope. It's a spiritual practice that's based in the present moment, and it assumes an uncertain future. And when we're hoping for something reasonable, we don't ever hold it by ourselves. Hope needs to be held in community. And so when I was working with this client, she was working towards what she could do in the moment, the present moment, knowing she was only going to have her illness become progressive. And she knew also that she was going to die. And she and her husband and 2 friends we all held together this reasonable hope she had. And then reasonable hope seeks specific goals and pathways. And so she made a decision about what she was going to do to reach that aspiration. And she created the pathways towards it by buying the books, writing in them, and wrapping them up. And reasonable hope allows for us to have conflicting feelings. It's not just a pie in the sky kind of a thing. It's real and it's present moment. So there's a saying in Tibet by the Dalai Lama that tragedy should be utilized as a source of strength. No matter what sort of difficulties, when we lose our hope, that's our real disaster. And Barbara Kingsolver says, figure out what to hope for and live inside that hope. And I love that. It's really important that we have something to hope for, even in these times that, we actually do have something to hope for now, but these times are challenging and it's easy to lose hope. So if you're in a situation where you feel hopeless, thinking about this idea of reasonable hope as a spiritual practice, sharing it with somebody and finding pathways towards what you can achieve reasonably is a path. So the next chapter is on wisdom. And so, as I said at the beginning, an ethical spiritual will includes values, stories, wisdom, history, love, sources of meaning, and basically what matters the very most to you. And remembering that among your loved ones, there'll be an opening, an access point at your death for this. And the gift of the written word is really priceless. So most of you will remember that in 1980, some of you will remember, depending on your age, that in 1988, there was a phenomenon in Arizona called the Biosphere Experiment. And that was when they took 66,000 panes of glass and they tried to, over area of 3 football fields, and they tried to recreate a semblance of the environment of the earth. And they put in a forest, they put in an ocean, they put in marsh, and they put in woodlands. They put in 8 human beings, and they put in 3,800 species of animals. the experiment failed after a couple of years. One of the things that happened was the humans weren't getting along. But the other thing that happened, which is really the point of my sharing this story with you, is that the trees started to bend over. And if this were a live webinar, I'd say, why do you think that was happening? And it's always interesting what people say. The reason the trees wouldn't stand up straight is that there was no wind in there. There was no resistance. And the hardest part of the tree, the central, the hardest wood of the tree is in the center of the tree, and it's called heartwood. And the heartwood didn't stay strong enough to hold the trees vertically. And so I tell you this story because it's through our suffering that we get strong. It's through the resistance, it's through the difficulties that we grow. We don't grow by having a good time. We grow from suffering, learning lessons. We get passionate about causes because we don't want people to suffer in the ways we have. And in fact, some of you may be doing work that has roots in your own suffering. I mean, I know I do. And usually we're passionate about the things where we know there's been suffering for ourselves, and we want to try and avoid other people having the same experience. So I love this biosphere experiment and the idea that the heartwood just didn't strengthen because there wasn't enough resistance. So one of the things that I ask people to do is to make a list of instructions, lessons, and values that have been most important to them, either in their past or present. What are the instructions or lessons you would want those you love to know? And so usually I get things like get a good education, find work you love, do something that's of service, learn how to love with gentleness, those kinds of things. They're usually little bullet points that people spill out and say. And then I ask people, what is the story behind it? Why have you chosen these things? Because the things that are most important to you are things that probably you have some experience with, some passion about, maybe you've had some suffering. So what is the story behind your wish to have your loved ones receive these instructions or these values or lessons from you? And then no one wants to be told what to do. So I always suggest to people that they change their language in their instructions to what I call the language of blessing or invitational language. And invitational language would be, for instance, if you have an instruction for one of your kiddos that's please go to college and find what you love or do work you love. May you would change it from something didactic and bossy sounding to may you find the joy in learning and find work you love. Or my hope for you is, it's invitational versus declarative language. Or I wish for you, something like that. So I'm just going to read a couple of blessings just to give you an idea of the kind of thing. I had a man in one of my bereavement groups whose wife died and left him a 10-year-old little girl. And she told him when she was dying that she was leaving him a letter. She told him where it was. No, I'm sorry. She told him she was leaving their daughter a letter, and she told him where it was and to please open it and give it to their daughter when she died. But when he went to get his daughter's letter, he found a letter to him. And I just want to read an excerpt from it. Let new love into your life. I know this will seem impossible for a long time, but at some point, I want you to open yourself to the possibility of loving someone else. You have so much to give, and I believe that you are at your best when you're in relationship with someone else. Falling in love again will in no way forming a partnership based on less intense feelings such as friendship and compatibility will in no way dishonor my memory or diminish the love we had for each other. In fact, it would honor our partnership it would give, and I would be glad that you have the strength to reach out again, to give and accept love. So in my bereavement groups, one of the things that people struggle with, especially the group where there's a lot of midlife and slightly older people who have lost long-term partners or spouses, one of the things that they struggle with is feeling the permission to date again. And so leaving something like this is so beautiful because we never know when life is going to take us. I was playing tennis about 10 years ago one summer, and my tennis partner turned to me and said, "Why are you out of breath? This isn't a tough tennis game." And I hadn't even noticed it or thought about it. And I went home and I started to walk up the stairs and I couldn't get to the landing. And as it turned out, I had pulmonary emboli and I came really close to dying. And my doctor said to me, "You are the last person on my caseload I would have expected this from." I hadn't traveled. I'm very physically active. I'm very health minded. But what it did was it brought me to my knees, because even though we do everything right, death is always at the door. And it's especially at the door with COVID. And I say that not to be morbid, but I say that be sure we're doing the things we want to be doing in case we get taken. So that's something, that was a blessing written from a mother to her husband at her death. So I just want to read a couple of other ones because they're very touching. And I think few of us ever had anything like this. This is from a grandfather to a newborn grandson. "May you know from the first moment of your life how much I love you. May you know from that very first moment there is nothing you can do in your life to make me or your grandmother or your mom or dad stop loving you. May you know this even as you take your first breath and as you take your last." How many of us got something like that from our parents? How many of us have even anything in handwriting from our parents? Here's another one. "I remember when you were a small boy, when asked what you wanted to be when you grew up, you answered, a daddy. Here you are. I wish for you the joy of a busy, messy, loud house. I wish for you a fridge covered in art projects and spelling tests. May you feel the pride of hearing a line in a Christmas play well spoken. I wish you the rich, rich texture of a family life that is uniquely yours. I wish for you, dear son, a small measure of the immense love and joy you have brought me." So I want to just go through this process because I think this is one of the most treasured things we can leave for our children. So I have two daughters. And I want to share with you, I have, if I were going through this process and someone said, make a list of instructions you would leave for your children, the first thing I would want to write to them would be trust your instincts. And as young women or as women, I think often it's hard because we've been socialized, many of us been socialized to be pleasing to others. So my first instruction to my daughters would be trust your instincts. So I say to myself, why is that so important to me? So the story behind that for me is that in 2007, when gay marriage was allowed, I got swept into getting married to somebody towards whom I felt very ambivalent. And the morning of the wedding, I had a dream. Actually, it was a nightmare. And the story was, I dreamt that my house was about to collapse, that water was crashing through the windows of the basement and the whole house was about to collapse. And I called the contractor to say, what should I do? And he said, there's nothing that can be done. That's not a dream you want to wake up to the morning you're getting married, right? And so, I could either cancel the wedding, which would have created suffering, or I could go through with it and try and make it work, which was what I did. And it didn't work. So I write this story. I've written this story to my two daughters. And if this was their father, I probably would not have written this story. but it's a different, it was with somebody different. And at the end, I convert my instruction and I say, may you learn to trust your instincts no matter what the voices around you are saying. And I feel so strongly about this because I feel like I went through and created suffering, not only for myself, but for somebody I cared about deeply by not following my instincts. So this is an example of a letter that you would create, sharing your wisdom in a way that those you love could receive it. So again, it's moving from declarative language to more invitational language. So just to think about the elements of a legacy letter that you're going to write, who is the recipient of the letter? And remember something, what was the context at the time? The historical, social, and psychological context, because I got swept up in the fact that gay people could get married. And there was a whole thing about that. So that's an important thing for me to put into a letter to my children, and because they may not remember that in the ways that I do. And then what is the story? What is the lesson you learned? What did you learn from the story? And then what is the blessing you would extend to them? So remember, I love this, the idea that a blessing is touching the unborn goodness of the other person. So I want to, I think that I'm just going to read one more thing and then we'll open up for questions. I want to read something that a friend of mine wrote about her father, who was a very well-known man. And it's about this work, and I just want to share this with you. Our parents have died. If we're lucky, we've been alongside. We've watched them go through and helped them with this difficult passage to their last breaths. And now, at least in my case, nearly all of their friends have also died. And this is what hit me so hard. Realizing a whole generation that walked with such big footsteps is gone. I have a photo in my studio of my father's last creative work. He was an extraordinarily accomplished and productive economist. He fell in love with economics as a teenager and practiced it for 75 odd years. I remember him on the phone giving an interview to the BBC weeks before he died at 95. And then one day, when he was dimming, he put down his pen and yellow pad as he had put down his chalk and stopped. The images on my wall are the last equations on his green board and the last writings in a very full wire basket on his desk. And that feels noble to me. You go on doing what you love until you can't go on any longer. Think of photographer Richard Avedon dying on assignment for the New Yorker. Maybe dying doing what you love is better than dying in your sleep. But what about the words that aren't spoken? My father, like nearly everyone else in his generation, left a will, which in lawyer language states how his property is to be divided. It doesn't offer a window into his heart. It doesn't leave a guide to his children or his grandchildren. It doesn't even say goodbye. Where did our words go? How did we all agree to be essentially silent about something so important as the quality of how we finish our lives? Whom do we blame? We tuck away decline and dying in nursing homes. We immerse ourselves in a youth culture, and somehow we exile our vulnerability, our fears, and our shame. So just in closing, to think about what are the things that are most important to you. What do you want to be remembered for? Because leaving a legacy is a way to, I'm trying to think of the word, is to, gosh, sorry, I can't, I'm just having a senior moment here. It's a way to sort of redefine your life and leave a meaning for people you love. One of the important things that I've had the privilege of doing is having people write obituaries for themselves, or not so much obituaries, that's the wrong word, leave lasting words that have been read at their funeral. And it's a beautiful way when people are dying to have a say in how they're being remembered. And it's something you might want to think about doing, because invariably when I lead a writing group for people with cancer, and I'm also do a group for people who are dying. And when I go to the funeral, the words that the person who died left are often the most meaningful thing that happens at the funeral. So just to think about what your lasting words want to be and put them into your will, put this document in with their will. And because it will carry meaning, and it'll touch the people that you love after you're gone. Also, what I do is I have a file called Death, which has all the usual things in it, all the insurance policies and the passwords and all of that stuff. But I also have a file of legacy work for my children. And when I die, they'll find that. And I think they'll want to, those things, they'll be more important to them after I'm gone than they might be now, where they're homeschooling their kids and really tied up with the day-to-dayness of life. And so just to think ahead too, and this is a time certainly in our life that's going to bear and should be documented, and how you lived through it, and how it's changed you for sure. So let's see what kind of questions people have, or what people may want to say.
I can read this. There's one, does your book contain an outline for a legacy letter and or a sample legacy letter? I look forward to reading your book, and thank you. Did you want to address that?
I actually, I would be happy to send samples and handouts from this talk. I don't know whether, Diane, you have a way to email people who are here, but I'd be glad to send out a sample legacy letter. I have this all on my computer, and I'd be glad to send it out. I don't know.
I think if people want
have
to
them
leave it in the chat, I can collect that
I'll
up.
tell you what would be easier for me, actually. If you email me directly, if you want that, and then I'll send it to you. So my email is Claire B. Willis, ClaireBWillis @gmail. And I'm happy to send you handouts that would help you get started with this process. I don't want to send them to anybody if not interested. Yeah.
I've put that in the chat, Claire B. Willis @gmail. And so people can copy that off the chat, and they can write to you and get that samples and other information. Another question, I have been struck by the similarity in your lessons to much of what was written by Louise Hay in the 1980s in a book, You Can Heal Your Life. In particular, the forgiveness methods and the enabling language about using could, not should, and writing down 3 to 5 good things each day, among other things. Although Hay's book is not about a legacy, but rather overcoming difficulties, I just wondered if you had read those. Definitely not scholarly, more self-help, but in essence, very similar. And I happened to be in a dark place when I found that book, and I found it really helped me. So the idea of ethical legacy works in the middle of life as well as toward the end. Could you comment on that?
Well, I haven't read Louise Hay's work. That's really interesting. But yes, legacy work, if you start to think about your legacy, it brings a mindfulness and attention to your day-to-day life that it's like what we're doing today is part of our legacy. How we are with one another, how we are at work is part of our legacy. And when you start to think about what your legacy will be, you get more mindful and thoughtful about how you carry yourself in the world. Also, it's a live document. So there are ways sometimes I write things and I go back and I mend them because I feel wiser than when I wrote them. And what I would want to offer is a little bit different now. So I think of it as a living document that I keep in my drawer. So.
If anybody has any other questions, they can put them in on the Q&A, but I think that's going to be our next one, is the last one, unless anybody adds to it. Why not deliver a legacy letter before death?
There's no reason not to. Go ahead and deliver them now. I think actually writing these letters of blessings to our children and those we love are real gifts. Don't wait. I wouldn't wait. There are some things I will wait for and some I would want to deliver now. It really depends on the content for me, but there's nothing that says not to deliver them now. And try and deliver them in your handwriting. I think that's really important.
I can chime in on that although I didn't do mine in my handwriting because I'm so gabby, I typed it out, and I did give it to my children. I can tell you that they would not have had it any other way. They loved it. They really, really treasured it. And both of them said, this is something we're going to take out and read again later, but we're glad we have it now.
Yeah.
It made a huge difference.
Yeah. I can't, I just trust me. I used to do a young adult group for people who'd lost parents to cancer, and they wanted so much to have something in writing from their parents. They were so upset they didn't have anything, especially when their parents knew they were dying. There was just nothing. So don't forget the written word. I can't say enough about that. Yeah.
So the way it came up for me was that I needed to give them their copies of my healthcare proxy. I was aware that COVID was a threat, and that the responsible thing to do would be to make sure they knew that they had my healthcare proxy. And so I used the legacy letter sort of as a transmittal letter for my will, power of attorney, and all the complete set of legal documents, which I wanted to make sure that they would have had anyway. And it certainly took a lot of the awfulness out of being handed a document that says last will and testament of your mom. It really made that into a much more meaningful experience for all of us. So I think that's it for questions. I don't know if you wanted to go on to another segment or do some sort of a wrap.
No, I feel like what I said pretty much wrapped it up with that letter. I don't have anything more to add. I would say, hold on. There is one more thing I could say. Well, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Conversation Project, but if you're not, Google the Conversation Project and download what they call the starter kit. And this is a really important part of legacy. It's letting your loved ones know exactly what you want specifically in terms of care as you grow older and are less able to say it. Because I can say that my bereavement groups, people who didn't know what their loved ones wanted and had to make decisions in the ER or in ICU, have complicated and protracted grief. And it's easy to say, can't think of her first name, Goodman, says, it's always too early to think about this until it's too late. And I would just urge you, if you don't have end of life DNRs and all of that in place in detail, to do it, because it's a gift to our loved ones that they'll know how to take care of us and know what our wishes are and not have to second guess it if we can't speak. And I think, I don't know about you, Diane, but I know that I've just redone my will because of COVID. And I brought it up to date. And I think having this lurking in the way it does can really be a strong catalyst towards taking action. and planning in a more thoughtful way.
We have a couple of questions. I'm not going to read everything that came in under the Q&A, but many things that came in under the Q&A simply said, thank you, thank you, thank you, in different ways. They were not questions. They were just saying how much they appreciated this. So there is a question that just come in. Have any lawyers ever suggested that including such a letter in a legal will might create problems by introducing the possibility that the letter would govern the interpretation of a testamentary trust?
I don't know how to answer that. The answer is I don't know.
Well, if anybody wants to weigh in on that.
I think even that potential would be a reason, actually, in itself, to leave legacy letters with loved ones for others, just so that you don't get into any kind of a legal tangle about it, that to find a more personal way of delivering it. Because that's not what you want. Boy, you don't want to get into some kind of contesting situation or litigious situation around this work. This is different work than that.
Understood, yeah. Others have added now, and someone helpfully suggested the conversationproject.org. Just saying that to make sure everybody knows the correct URL.
Ellen Goodman is the one who started that. I couldn't pull up her name, but I love what she says about it's always too early until it's too late. And I think when I had these pulmonary emboli 10 years ago, who knew, right? I mean, there's just, life happens and life is so tenuous, and to treat it that way is to really treasure this work, I think.
Well, someone has asked, will this event be recorded so we can revisit it or send it to friends and family? The answer to that is yes. It is being recorded, and you can go to the City Bar YouTube channel. Give us a few days and we will have it up there. And another comment, I would love to see Ms. Will's work be presented every time a course on estate planning is given at the City Bar. So we'll make sure that the City Bar knows about that. We've had 62 people. It's gone up to 68 and down to 58 at various times, but that's a pretty large number of people from the City Bar who can make their wishes known directly to the program office if they want to do so. Before we go, I do want to make sure people understand that the Senior Lawyers Committee of the Bar is giving its next event in just a couple days on December 15th, and that one will be about reintegrating into the community after incarceration. Will be about rehabilitation. But we have Claire's email address still up for you. I don't see any new Q&A coming in. Wait, I do. That is just a comment saying this should be included in all law school estate and trust courses. And some more people saying thank you. There is a clear tension between the people who are asking about this being included in the estate and trust courses and people who are suggesting that there are issues raised for trust and estate lawyers who have to be worried about interpreting trusts. I know when I did my letter, I didn't put it within the body of the will. I had it separate. And I think that some of these questions presume that we were talking about inserting it into the will. Just to be very clear, we're not.
Yeah,
we're not. We're talking about a separate letter. I happen to have, in my personal way of doing it, transmitted it at the same time as a will. I don't know that we have any more questions coming in. It's maybe a good time to wrap up. Please remember clairebwillis@gmail.com. Her book
No,
is
I'm happy to share the PowerPoint, which has a lot of what I said on it, if people would like that. So just you just need to contact me if you want the PowerPoint, which is basically a review of what I said for the most part, except for the stuff on gratitude. That's separate.
I think that being in front of an audience of lawyers, you were bound to get the kinds of questions that you probably don't get when you're
right. Yeah, no, I couldn't answer a lot of them because I just don't know. But I never intended to be attached to a will. So let me say that.
And I also think that it's something that the lawyers can deal with in another forum, but I want to leave with some emphasis on some of the really joyous and lasting things. Oh, wait, looks like, well, that's not a question. We have more people saying, thank you for bringing this. And I think that's what we want to do, is emphasize our gratitude for this discussion. I know it's a time when so many of us are walking around aware of the difficulties and just constantly in a state of sort of guardedness and worry and prolonged anxiety.
Uncertainty. So, it's just this pervasive uncertainty.
Right. So I think what we have to be grateful for is that we're coming together to talk about it more than anything else. It's something I think people have been hungering for. They've been wanting. I mean, we've had some really great attendance. We've had 22 questions and more in the chat. So I think everybody really appreciates this. And I hope that we can have you back again sometime.
I'd love to come back and talk about my other book, which it feels is incredibly timely right now.
If you want to say a few words about that when we wrap, that's fine.
So I have a book I launched about a month ago called Opening to Grief, Finding Your Way from Loss to Peace. And one of the things about COVID is that it's created losses and griefs, but it's also opened up for most of us old griefs that we may not have grieved. And this talk I give is about the various ways grief presents itself, which I think most of us aren't familiar with, that we think of grief as sorrow and sadness, but grief is anxiety, it's irritability, it's anger. We see this in our politicians. I don't have to name names, but I'm sure you can see that politically, a lot of the rhetoric is rage, and some of it is from grief. Impatience, regret, but also positive emotions like gratitude and relief are also parts of grief, the expression of grief. And I think often we don't recognize that we're grieving until we're able to name it and identify it. And then how we respond to it is different. And if we don't grieve, what's going to happen is that it's going to come out sideways. We'll overeat, we'll be lethargic, we'll be depressed, we'll be anxious. There's just so many expressions of grief. And I would welcome the opportunity to talk about this because it feels so compelling to me in these times when there's just so much loss everywhere. And there's threatened loss too, politically. I mean, we're living with incredible uncertainty. And how do we manage that and find a stable center to get through this without getting wigged around in constant reactivity? So.
Thank you so very, very much. I know we didn't get a chance to answer all of the legal questions. I know it's been pointed out that you need to remember that if the will is being published on a public registry, you may want not to put very personal things into the will itself. And it's also being pointed out that legacy letters sometimes involve leaving donations to organizations. And I think that we know that's quite appropriate, even if it's not for personal, a personal bequest. It's bequest. It's something that you can write when you're leaving money or other things of value to an organization. I hope everybody makes some notes and starts writing their own legacy letters. And I look forward to hearing from people who want to have suggestions for future events. And thank you all for coming. And I will say one more time, Claire B. Willis at gmail.com. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.